Domain 4 Compliance and Audit Management. 4.0 Introduction. Organizations face new challenges as they migrate from traditional data centers to the cloud. Delivering, measuring, and communicating compliance with a multitude of regulations across multiple jurisdictions are among the largest of these challenges. Customers and providers alike need to understand and appreciate the jurisdictional differences and their implications on existing compliance and audit standards, processes, and practices. The distributed and virtualized nature of cloud computing requires significant adjustment from approaches based on definite and physical instantiations of information and processes. In addition to providers and customers, regulators and auditors are also adjusting to the new world of cloud computing. Few existing regulations were written to account for virtualized environments or cloud deployments. A cloud user can be challenged to show auditors that the organization is in compliance. Understanding the interaction of cloud computing and the regulatory environment is a key component of any cloud strategy. Cloud customers, auditors, and providers must consider and understand the following: regulatory implications for using a particular cloud service or provider, giving particular attention to any cross-border or multi-jurisdictional issues when applicable. Assignment of compliance responsibilities between the provider and customer, including indirect providers, i.e., the cloud provider of your cloud provider. This includes the concept of compliance inheritance, where a provider may have parts of their service certified as compliant, which removes this from the audit scope of the customer, but the customer is still responsible for the compliance of everything they build on top of the provider. Provider capabilities for demonstrating compliance, including document generation, evidence production, and process compliance, in a timely manner. Some additional cloud-specific issues to pay particular attention to include the role of provider audits and certifications and how those affect customer audit, or assessment, scope. Understanding which features and services of a cloud provider are within the scope of which audits and assessments. Managing compliance and audits over time. Working with regulators and auditors who may lack experience with cloud computing technology. Working with providers who may lack audit and/or regulatory compliance experience. 4.1 Overview. Achieving and maintaining compliance with a plethora of modern regulations and standards is a core activity for most information security teams and a critical tool of governance and risk management. So much so that the tools and teams in this realm have their own acronym, GRC, for governance, risk, and compliance. Although very closely related with audits, which are a key mechanism to support, assure, and demonstrate compliance, there is more to compliance than audits and more to audits than using them to assure regulatory compliance. For our purposes, compliance validates awareness of and adherence to corporate obligations, for example, corporate social responsibility, ethics, applicable laws, regulations, contracts, strategies, and policies. The compliance process assesses the state of that awareness and adherence, further assessing the risks and potential costs of non-compliance against the costs to achieve compliance, and hence prioritize, fund, and initiate any corrective actions deemed necessary. Audits are a key tool for proving, or disproving, compliance. We also use audits and assessments to support non-compliance risk decisions. This section discusses these interrelated domains individually to better focus on the implications cloud computing has on each. 4.1.1 Compliance. Information technology in the cloud, or anywhere really, is increasingly subject to a plethora of policies and regulations from governments, industry groups, business relationships, and other stakeholders. Compliance management is a tool of governance. It is how an organization assesses, remediates, and proves it is meeting these internal and external obligations. Regulations, in particular, typically have strong implications for information technology and its governance, especially in terms of monitoring, management, protection, and disclosure. Many regulations and obligations require a certain level of security, which is why information security is so deeply coupled with compliance. Security controls are thus an important tool to assure compliance, and evaluation and testing of these controls is a core activity for security professionals. This includes assessments even when performed by dedicated internal or external auditors. 4.1.1.1 How cloud changes compliance. As with security, compliance in the cloud is a shared responsibility model. Both the cloud provider and customer have responsibilities, but the customer is always ultimately responsible for their own compliance. These responsibilities are defined through contracts, audits/assessments, and specifics of the compliance requirements. Cloud customers, particularly in public cloud, must rely more on third-party attestations of the provider to understand their compliance alignment and gaps. Since public cloud providers rely on economies of scale to manage costs, they often will not allow customers to perform their own audits. Instead, similar to financial audits of public companies, they engage with a third-party firm to perform audits and issue attestations. Thus, the cloud customer doesn't typically get to define the scope or perform the audit themselves. They will instead need to rely on these reports and attestations to determine if the service meets their compliance obligations. Many cloud providers are certified for various regulations and industry requirements, such as PCI DSS, SOC 1, SOC 2, HIPAA, best practices/frameworks like CSA/CCM, and global/regional regulations like the EU GDPR. These are sometimes referred to as pass-through audits. A pass-through audit is a form of compliance inheritance. In this model, all or some of the cloud provider's infrastructure and services undergo an audit to a compliance standard. The provider takes responsibility for the costs and maintenance of these certifications. Provider audits, including pass-through audits, need to be understood within their limitations. They certify that the provider is compliant. It is still the responsibility of the customer to build compliant applications and services on the cloud. This means the provider's infrastructure/services are not within scope of a customer's audit/assessment. But everything the customer builds themselves is still within scope. The customer is still ultimately responsible for maintaining the compliance of what they build and manage. For example, if an IaaS provider is PCI DSS certified, the customer can build their own PCI compliant service on that platform, and the provider's infrastructure and operations should be outside the customer's assessment scope. However, the customer can just as easily run afoul of PCI and fail their assessment if they don't design their own application running in the cloud properly. With compliance inheritance, the cloud provider's infrastructure is out of scope for a customer's compliance audit, but everything the customer configures and builds on top of the certified services is still within scope. Cloud compliance issues aren't merely limited to pass-through audits. The nature of cloud also creates additional differentiators. Many cloud providers offer globally distributed data centers running off a central management console/platform. It is still the customer's responsibility to manage and understand where to deploy data and services and still maintain their legal compliance across national and international jurisdictions. Organizations have the same responsibility in traditional computing, but the cloud dramatically reduces the friction of these potentially international deployments. For example, a developer can potentially deploy regulated data in a non-compliant country without having to request an international data center and sign off on multiple levels of contracts, should the proper controls not be enabled to prevent this. Not all features and services within a given cloud provider are necessarily compliant and certified/audited with respect to all regulations and standards. It is incumbent on the cloud provider to communicate certifications and attestations clearly, and for customers to understand the scopes and limitations. 4.1.2 Audit Management. Proper organizational governance naturally includes audit and assurance. Audits must be independently conducted and should be robustly designed to reflect best practice, appropriate resources, and tested protocols and standards. Before delving into cloud implications, we need to define the scope of audit management related to information security. Audits and assessments are mechanisms to document compliance with internal or external requirements, or identify deficiencies. Reporting needs to include a compliance determination, as well as a list of identified issues, risks, and remediation recommendations. Audits and assessments aren't limited to information security, but those related to information security typically focus on evaluating the effectiveness of security management and controls. Most organizations are subject to a mix of internal and external audits, and assessments to assure compliance with internal and external requirements. All audits have variable scope and statement of applicability, which defines what is evaluated, for example, all systems with financial data, and to which controls, for example, an industry standard, custom scope, or both. An attestation is a legal statement from a third party, which can be used as their statement of audit findings. Attestations are a key tool when evaluating and working with cloud providers since the cloud customer does not always get to perform their own assessments. Audit management includes the management of all activities related to audits and assessments, such as determining requirements, scope, scheduling, and responsibilities. 4.1.2.1 How cloud changes audit management. Some cloud customers may be used to auditing third-party providers, but the nature of cloud computing and contracts with cloud providers will often preclude things like on-premises audits. Customers should understand that providers can, and often should, consider on-premises audits a security risk when providing multi-tenant services. Multiple on-premises audits from large numbers of customers present clear logistical and security challenges, especially when the provider relies on shared assets to create the resource pools. Customers working with these providers will have to rely more on third-party attestations rather than the audits they perform themselves. Depending on the audit standard, actual results may only be releasable under a non-disclosure agreement, NDA, which means customers will need to enter into a basic legal agreement before gaining access to attestations for risk assessments or other evaluative purposes. This is often due to legal or contractual requirements with the audit firm, not due to any attempts and obfuscation by the cloud provider. Cloud providers should understand that customers still need assurance that the provider meets their contractual and regulatory obligations, and should thus provide rigorous third-party attestations to prove they meet their obligations, especially when the provider does not allow direct customer assessments. These should be based on industry standards, with clearly defined scopes and the list of specific controls evaluated. Publishing certifications and attestations, to the degree legally allowed, will greatly assist cloud customers in evaluating providers. The Cloud Security Alliance STAR Registry offers a central repository for providers to publicly release these documents. Some standards, such as C16, attest that documented controls work as designed/required. The standard doesn't necessarily define the scope of controls, so both are needed to perform a full evaluation. Also, attestations and certifications don't necessarily apply equally to all services offered by a cloud provider. Providers should be clear about which services and features are covered, and it is the responsibility of the customer to pay attention and understand the implications on their use of the provider. Certain types of customer technical assessments and audits, such as a vulnerability assessment, may be limited in the provider's terms of service, and may require permission. This is often to help the provider distinguish between a legitimate assessment and an attack. It's important to remember that attestations and certifications are point-in-time activities. An attestation is a statement of an over a period of time assessment and may not be valid at any future point. Providers must keep any published results current or they risk exposing their customers to risks of noncompliance. Depending on contracts, this could even lead to legal exposures to the provider. Customers are also responsible for ensuring they rely on current results and track when their provider's statuses change over time. Artifacts are the logs, documentation, and other materials needed for audits and compliance. They are the evidence to support compliance activities. Both providers and customers have responsibilities for producing and managing their respective artifacts. Collecting and maintaining artifacts of compliance will change when using a cloud provider. Customers are ultimately responsible for the artifacts to support their own audits, and thus need to know what the provider offers, and create their own artifacts to cover any gaps. For example, by building more robust logging into an application since server logs on PAS may not be available. 4.2 Recommendations. Compliance, audit, and assurance should be continuous. They should not be seen as merely point-in-time activities, and many standards and regulations are moving more towards this model. This is especially true in cloud computing, where both the provider and customer tend to be in more constant flux and are rarely ever in a static state. Cloud providers should clearly communicate their audit results, certifications, and attestations with particular attention to the scope of assessments, which specific features/services are covered in which locations and jurisdictions, how customers can deploy compliant applications and services in the cloud, any additional customer responsibilities and limitations. Cloud providers must maintain their certifications/attestations over time and proactively communicate any changes in status. Cloud providers should engage in continuous compliance initiatives to avoid creating any gaps and thus exposures for their customers. Provide customers commonly needed evidence and artifacts of compliance, such as logs of administrative activity the customer cannot otherwise collect on their own. Cloud customers should understand their full compliance obligations before deploying, migrating to, or developing in the cloud. Evaluate a provider's third-party attestations and certifications and align those to compliance needs. Understand the scope of assessments and certifications, including both the controls and the features/services covered. Attempt to select auditors with experience in cloud computing, especially if pass-through audits and certifications will be used to manage the customer's audit scope. Ensure they understand what artifacts of compliance the provider offers, and effectively collect and manage those artifacts. Create and collect their own artifacts when the provider's artifacts are not sufficient. Keep a register of cloud providers used, relevant compliance requirements, and current status. The Cloud Security Alliance Cloud Controls Matrix can support this activity.